Hello and welcome to Chain Reaction, a podcast series examining America's role in the world. I am your host, Aaron Stein, the Director of Research at the Foreign Policy Research Institute in Philadelphia. Every 2 weeks, we will talk to experts about a variety of topics and why they matter for U.S. foreign policy. Hello and welcome. Today I'm talking to Kelly Grieco, a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council with the New American Engagement Initiative about the war in Ukraine. We are a month into the conflict, and clearly we are in operational pause in a static battle. And there's been a lot of talk basically since the first day about the air component of this war. On this podcast, we've talked about the no-fly zone. So if you haven't listened to that episode, it's one back. But I was thinking that we would talk a little bit more in depth about how we think the Russians are operated. So Kelly, I guess the first question to you to just kick it off is, after a month, what are your thoughts on how the Russians are using air power?
Well, thank you, Aaron, for having me on. I really appreciate the chance to talk about air power and the war in Ukraine. Gosh, where are we a month in? I can't believe it's a month, first of all. Second, I feel like everything right now is so much impressions because we're very dependent on open source social media, and how representative the information we have is a question. But I will say that I would have predicted that the Russians would have a harder time gaining air superiority if the Ukrainians were smart before the war started. I just never would have thought it would go this badly, in the sense that in the air war, they showed deficits at every level of war: strategic, operational, tactical. And it's only getting worse. That's the remarkable thing, because they've used so much of their missiles in particular at this point, when they were having so much trouble figuring things out, that even the recovery, I don't, if they were to get their tactics, worked out, what is the inventory like to actually be able to execute a better air power campaign?
Yeah, I mean, I think the things that a lot of people were, have fixated on are broader challenges, and perhaps you can talk a little bit about this. It is not easy to conduct a suppression of enemy air defense as the SEED campaign. And it's certainly not easy to conduct a defeat enemy air defense campaign, the DEED campaign. But when you look at how the Russians perhaps went from night one or day zero, moving out into a month, I don't think that they're going to have any capability in maintaining air superiority or to achieve air superiority. I think that's out the window. But can you talk us through why you thought that they would have challenges with this before the conflict? Because I think a lot of people thought that they would be able to move relatively quickly into taking control of the skies.
Yeah. So, I mean, clearly the numbers were in their favor, in the sense of just the massive asymmetry and differences in terms of any type of aircraft or missile system or defenses. But what it comes down to, though, I think, is how smart were the Ukrainians going to be with their mobile SAMs? And if they were smart and they had learned from, particularly watching Yugoslavia, in the Kosovo War, and they could keep those mobile, it would allow them to continue to be able to contest the airspace. I mean, the fact that the United States and NATO air forces were not able to establish air superiority essentially in Kosovo, that's why we flew above 15,000 feet the entire war. I think it gives, it shows that an actor even that has a real disadvantage in numbers, if they're smart with those mobile SAMs, you can essentially create an air defense in being. And that threat of, pop-up SAMs, right, is enough to really keep expensive, exquisite aircraft further back from the battlefield.
So a lot of our listeners won't truly understand what the pop-up threat is. Can you talk people through what that means? Because I know that I use that shorthanded, particularly on Twitter. But people who listen to this podcast may not quite understand the value of having a mobile surface air missile system and how you pop up to contest even the superior air force.
So if you look at Saddam Hussein in the first Gulf War, night one, we start the big air campaign. And Saddam's air forces, air defense systems all popped up. They all lit up, and which is actually really helpful, right? Because they light up and you now know where they're located. And so we were able to sort of destroy those things that were stationary. So you've given the address of the system. What we did see in the Gulf War, though, was that some of the Scud launchers that they were on trucks, we had a really hard time finding them because once, they're used, right? You release your missile, you can scoot at that point. You move away, and by the time you hit the target, it's already moved. And we actually saw that the Yugoslavia in the Kosovo War had figured this out. And they learned from Saddam Hussein, and they did not light up all of their surface-to-air missiles on the first night. And instead, we're always sort of popping up a little bit here, a little bit there, so we could never really get all of them. And the mobility thing is the biggest part, because it's really hard to distinguish even today what is a normal truck, a civilian truck, from what is something that's actually carrying a surface-to-air missile, and to do it quickly enough that you're actually able to destroy that before it's moved and you've lost track of it.
And when you mean by light up, you mean is that they turn their radars on and they radiate because they're looking to try and track incoming aircraft to shoot them down. So like basically there's an advantage to the defenders maybe on night one is to not radiate and to wait until you can lure them into traps.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, this is sort of everyone learning in a weird way from Saddam Hussein. And my understanding is after the Kosovo War, some Iraqis did actually go to Kosovo, or not Kosovo, sorry, went to Serbia or Yugoslavia at that time to try to learn from what they had done.
Right. Because it was the evolutionary tactics. So one of the big takeaways, and I'm curious to hear your thought, I've had this, is people are looking for big takeaways. And I agree with you that the challenge is that we live in a one-sided information environment. So we have absolutely no idea what the attrition rate is on Ukrainian forces. We just don't know.
No.
The Russians are putting out more videos recently, but we don't have as good a sense as we do of Russian losses, which are significant. But one of the takeaways I have, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts, is U.S. estimates on Russian origin, short, medium, and potentially longer range surface-to-air missile systems are pretty accurate in that these things, if used well, are actually pretty lethal. And I'm curious why you think the Russians may not have grappled with those lessons in that sort of one day where they lost, I can't remember how many aircraft it was, but they lost a significant amount of aircraft in one day, sort of a couple days into the conflict as it became clear that they had a real fight on their hands. Yeah,
so I think there are a couple of things going on here. One is we're actually seeing just a lot of the consequences of hubris on the part of the Russians. And that they thought this was just going to be sort of like, a knife through butter. And it when it didn't, they've had to now go through this period of sort of readjustment, but they let themselves really vulnerable after in the first, few days, week even. So I think that's one part of it. I think the other part of it is, and I think you see this actually reflected in a lot of the discussion about the air war itself, is a lot of focus on control of the skies, in control of what I would call the blue skies. So high altitude airspace where fighters and bombers typically operate. And a neglect of how are they going to gain control of lower altitude airspace. And in fact, we've seen this is actually what I think, credit to the Ukrainians have been really smart about this, and that it's not just the surface-to-air missiles, the higher altitude ones that are a problem for the Russians. It's that in order to destroy a lot of the things on the ground, through air power, they have to fly low. And as soon as they're flying low, they are now in that envelope of, these shoulder-fired missiles, what are called manpads. And I think that there was a little bit of a oversimplification of what an air control fight would look like and missing that vertical piece of it.
So this is curious to me because do you think the Russians are going low to get beneath the radar horizons of potential pop-up threats? Or do you think they're going low to get lost in the ground clutter, maybe at the beginning against Ukrainian fighters, although I think we can talk about the Ukrainian Air Force in a second, although I think that's dissipated. Or do you think they're going low to increase the accuracy of dumb bombs because they don't have the capacity of doing precision guided munitions? I don't know the answer. I'm curious what you think.
I think it's a combination of 1 and 3.
So the radar horizon and dumb bombs.
Yes, I think it's a combination of 1 and 3. I think, part of it is that they were surprised by apparently this more robust mobile, capability of these long range SAMs. So to evade them, they're going low. But the problem is, it's like even if they wanted to fly much higher, they have such a limited capacity of PGMs that if they're going to try to be more accurate, think about how distributed their forces are too on the ground. Then they have to fly lower just to be able to accurately try to hit something. And one of the things I think we've really seen too is that the sense I have, and Justin Bronca's talk about this, is that they don't seem to have very good coordination between ground forces and air power. And so, we don't know what their air tasking order, the place where you would actually organize an air power campaign and assign tasks to, air forces. I don't know how much they actually really have knowledge short of line of sight of knowing where their own forces are. Right. And then they have the added problem of the fact that the Ukrainians are a former Soviet country, so they actually have a lot of the same equipment, yes, which makes it harder.
There's another question that this pops into my head is battle force tracking, particularly in these contested urban areas. Like, let's take, because if we're to believe open source, the primacy of Russian sorties are in the north around Kyiv and Kharkiv, and in the south, right? And the south, I believe, is more naval aviation, and the north is more is VKS. It's the Russian Aerospace Forces. If you were to trust the open source maps, you have twists and turns of control of territory. Even we're recording this on Friday, March 25th. There were reports that as they've settled into stalemate or into static battle lines and they take their operational pause, is that the Russians sort of retreated from certain places where they were overextended their logistics. And so the Ukrainians have taken back some places. This is a huge challenge in the U.S. Air Force, which is battle force tracking. And you saw this in the ISIS campaign where everybody's using the same thing, if it was U.S. origin kit, about how to differentiate which side is which. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on how that could also play into some of the limited use of air power itself.
Yeah, so I think this is actually something, as you said, we've seen early signs of this. This has always been challenging, trying to, not have friendly fire kind of incidents. This is one of the really early challenges around using air power with ground forces. But I think what we're seeing is that, one, in a really fluid battlefield, it's always harder because some of the things that you do in the past, which is a forward line, where it's if you think about an old, style conventional battlefield, it's well, the front line is up to here now. So bomb forward of that and we won't hit our own ground forces. Doesn't work quite as well in these very fluid environments. And I think, and also you sometimes use coordinating altitude. So it's ground forces, you can operate things in the airspace up to this altitude, and everything above that will be where the Air Force operates. One of the things that I think we're seeing is that those sort of 20th century solutions don't really work as well in the 21st century because there's so much more access to airspace now. The fact that you have these TB2s, this is the Turkish drone that the Ukrainians are using really well, but then we have a whole, all these quadcopters, all of these stingers. I mean, it's one of the things that I've thought about. I have a lot of reasons I don't like no-fly zones in this situation, and I know you've already talked about that in previous episodes.
We'll come back to that, yeah.
But I just think, can you imagine if you were a pilot, and a NATO pilot, and were asked for a no-fly zone right now, knowing that the Ukrainians have all these stingers?
No, and no, and the fact that they still have mobile SAMs, particularly in the west of the country, it's fratricide written all over it.
Rockets, all of this, and so I think one of the things, in some sense, I think what the Russians are facing, in some sense, is not just a problem it's unique to the Russians. Of how are you going to really coordinate air-ground cooperation in this contested and highly contested environment where there's just a lot of stuff being flown, particularly in low to medium altitude airspace.
I want to come back to that because that's a really good point, and that's something we also saw in the ISIS war. But just to put a pin in the go low debate, because I agree, I think it was a combination of 1 and 3. It's 1 is they're trying to get low to avoid radar horizons on surface-to-air missiles, and 3, it's in contested spaces. They want to make dumb bombs as accurate as possible. But this also reminds me of 2 facets of the American experience. I think we've blended 3 American experience, well, 4, right? So it's the challenges in North Vietnam, right? And then that was where U.S. pilots, for a number of reasons, but sort of at the 30,000 foot level, had challenged finding pop-up threats from the North Vietnamese, sort of the first generation of Russian surface-to-air missiles. Kosovo in staying mobile. Desert Storm, only in that it was learned relatively quickly, and again, operating a desert versus Ukraine, going low was not necessarily good, right? Versus staying at medium to high. And 4, sort of the Israeli experience in 1973 War of Attrition, where the surface air missile threat really became. So those four factors are all sort of coming together, and the Russians are grappling with that. We learned from all of that. So if they're going back and looking at this, are they going to be able to learn from their experiences? Is the next iteration of Russian air power going to look different than this, or are they stuck in this because of the way that their air force is set up?
Well, I would just take a moment and say, have we learned from this?
I think we've gotten better from Vietnam to like. No. I think we've seen iterations and changes.
Okay, fair enough. I mean, first of all, the U.S. Air Force has been tremendously successful, particularly in this post-Cold War period, right? I mean, that's why people are proposing no-fly zones and right. Almost thinking like it's an on and off switch of, denying air power to someone else. I would just say, though, is that what I see some of the reaction to in the U.S. Air Force community to some of the reaction of what Russia's done wrong. One of the big criticisms, for example, I hear is that they didn't adopt like the linear air power strategy and of, go for a massive air power campaign to suppress enemy air defenses. And then you start your ground war and, things like that. And, that there was a New York Times article earlier this week that was talking a lot about like dogfights, even though there's very few of these actually happening over Ukraine. I feel like there are ways in which there's a danger actually for the Air Force that it's going to take the message of the Gulf War model was right. Mm-hmm. We have a massive air campaign, you destroy all that, and then you enable ground forces to be able to operate. But I think with the proliferation of the kind of air power threats we're seeing, man-pads, drones, other things, that's actually not realistic anymore. It's not as though you can establish air superiority in a fight now, and then it's a permanent condition that lasts. That's something that's going to have to be actively, achieved and maintained throughout a fight. And so I'm a little nervous actually about the lesson that we might take away from this.
So that brings us back to the pin, which is if you're thinking about like altitude blocks, like something like the TB2, and then it's much cheaper in commercial, I guess, distant cousins, these DJI type quadcopters. They fly much lower than your typical fighter, and I think particularly with the TB2, it packs a punch. I think many analysts, myself included, thought that the Russians would be better at this in terms of counter TB2 sweeps. But in a country the size of Ukraine, I guess what I misunderstood, what I guess didn't really account for, is that how much space they would have to operate. So can you talk a little bit about the role that drones are playing in this, and perhaps why something like the TB2 is actually causing fits for the Russians, even though it should be something that is relatively easily handled?
Yeah. So this is, I have to say, if there's like one real mystery to me of this war, I would say the air war at least, it's on the Russian side of why they're not better at counter drone stuff, including electronic warfare. Like there's images that like we actually see, it looks like Ukrainian drones are actually able to like really loiter over the space, which suggests like, what's going on. And I wonder if that's a little bit about how they may have allocated certain capabilities, especially EW capabilities among the forces, particularly the way they were like really distributed and broken up at first, that I don't know if there are ground units that are just lacking, certain capabilities, if that's part of it. But what I do think is, first of all, everyone, people like to, we're very focused on the technological solution to the drone problem. And I think it is worth noting, like even some of US tests of counter drone technology have only had like a 60% detection success against, some of these smaller quadcopters. They're just hard to really detect in the noise, because they're flying low. So I think that's one thing, is that it's actually a harder problem set. Two, there is a numbers game here. So, things that you might use to jam, if you have enough drones, you might be able to, overwhelm the jammers potentially. And three, I think the other thing that's kind of unique about it is, think back to like the World War II or the Cold War, you kind of had like an enemy order of battle, and you knew sort of like how many other aircraft they have, maybe how many air defense systems they had. You can kind of keep track of like how much you're destroying. I don't think either side knows right now anything about the drone piece of like how many drones are operating, what percentage has been destroyed. And I wonder how that, I've just thought a little bit about how that must complicate some of these planning, calculations.
Yeah, and I think the other thing about the Ukraine war is, when this started, the constant resupply. So even though the Ukrainians are being attrited, and even on the drone piece, like on the TB2 piece, like I don't think the claims are as sort of grandiose as the Russians that they shot down 1 million or whatever they say. But I also don't think it's just one, right? I think it's somewhere between one and like whatever the Russians say. But if you have a tap open that can replace them, those actually become quite valuable because you're not actually losing a pilot. You if you sneak through and strike something, it's good. If you get shot down, you have more coming.
Yes.
So the attrition curve for something like a TB2 was actually on the favor of the Ukrainians because of the costs to counter them. Russia is having to dedicate fighters that have to then fly into the challenges we were just talking about.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the crazy things about this, right? Is that the exchange ratios we're seeing in some of this, which really shows, I think, how air war, in my opinion, is actually starting to move towards favoring the defender. I mean, one of the sort of axiomatic beliefs of air power, and this has a lot to do with the interwar air power, theorists, was that air power was inherently an offensive domain, right? Stanley Baldwin, British Prime Minister in the 30s, said, famously said, like, the bomber will always get through, and not so true anymore.
Yeah, no, and even during the Cold War, the assessment was invest in offense to force them onto defense because we're an aerospace power and the Russians are not. I think it puts a lot of emphasis moving forward on things like attritables, like not a TB2 per se. It's too small and it's too slow, but something that goes faster but is in the same price point. At cheap, $5 to $10 million per copy, and long range munitions. And particularly ones that can strike dynamic targets. This is not easy. But to bring this back, I think this goes back to some of the misconceptions about air power. There's been a lot of focus is that the Ukrainians still have some of their air forces flying. It was the focus of that New York Times piece, which I can't remember the name of, that in a CNN interview where they are interviewing these very valiant and brave Ukrainian pilots who still fly every day. But I would argue that the Russians, in terms of the Ukrainian manned or crewed fixed wing fighter fleet, has essentially neutralized them, right? It's the TB2s that are the problem. Can you talk a little bit maybe about the Ukrainian side, maybe why just counting isn't the best way to think about the air power breakdown between the two sides?
No, I agree with you. I mean, I think, first of all, I think the article and that CNN interview, are both wonderful in the sense that they capture the bravery of these Ukrainian pilots. And, it's just interesting to hear from them in this war. I think, though, we sort of are still fascinated by like the Top Gun kind of vision of air power, even if though Top Gun's Navy, but, it's air power. And I think what we're missing is, though there's like an attraction, like a lore about, the fighter pilot mystique and all that, is that in this war, at least, dogfights are not really where it's at in terms of like what's actually important for air control. I think the Russians have been averaging like 200 sorties a day. They're now up to 300. Most of them are not even over Ukraine. They're long range fires. I think it's something between 5 and 15 sorties.
I saw 5 and 40 or 5. Maybe I'm misremembering, but it doesn't matter. It's less.
It's small.
It's tiny.
It's really tiny. And so I think if you're asking me, like, what's the center of gravity of the Ukrainian, effort to try to keep this contested, it's air defense systems. I would like to have a feature story on a Ukrainian, mobile SAM operator or a TB2 pilot.
Yep.
Maybe they're too busy, but,
No, no, that's true, because I think the lessons for the U.S. Air Force after this should be about the continued challenges we saw in Kosovo.
It should, and I think there's also another lesson too, which is if we're thinking about great power competition, particularly thinking about the Indo-Pacific, we are going to be on the strategic defense, and there are a lot of ways that we can create these kinds of dilemmas. The kind of dilemmas Ukraine has created for the Chinese, potentially for Indo-Pacific actors to do the same, whether it be Taiwan or Japan, to create those same kind of, like, there's kind of a good news, bad news, or bad news, good news story here. It may be harder to project air power in the ways that we have the last 30 years against adversaries that have certain capabilities, but it actually may also make it easier in some way to deter other revisionist actors.
Yeah, Taiwan's very hilly too. A lot harder to find stuff in valleys with specific radar systems. And but so this brings us back to sort of the final two pieces here. One is that this is still a political debate in the U.S. I've always thought this silly, but like, let's play devil's advocate. There's continued calls, and most of it comes from the Ukrainians themselves, is to resupply their fixed-wing fleet, is to bring in surplus MiG-29s. Let's just leave out the fact that they've been upgraded. I've never thought that valuable, and I've always thought that you just should flood the zone with surface-to-air missiles. Can you talk about, like, you just foreshadowed it, but like the MiG-29 debate in itself and how you think it would play out, if it has any bearing on the conflict whatsoever?
I mean, the MiG-29 debate to me is so misguided. You know, in this, I mean, I'm sorry, I can't go back to I have to go back to the fact that they are modernized. Yeah. Because it would take months for a Ukrainian pilot, to be able to actually be combat ready in that aircraft. Yes, they could probably, you know, get right in the cockpit and probably turn it on and fly it, I would imagine. But there's a difference between being able to get it in the air and actually to be able to like operate in a combat environment where this has to be like instinct, right? Like you don't want to be in an encounter with an enemy aircraft and you're thinking, okay, which button am I supposed to be pressing here? And so this is just like silly in that regard, in the sense that like it's much more complicated, and where these pilots going to train, you know, it gets very complicated. But I think your larger point is, if you're looking at what Ukraine could have anything it wanted in terms of for its air defense war, for its war, right? The air war. It's surface to air missiles.
Yeah.
That's really what matters, especially when there's not a lot of Russian aircraft flying into their airspace either.
Yeah, no, I mean, the right long-range Russian system, like a derivative of the S-300, could challenge their operations over Belarus. You know, and and then underneath that, your various road mobile SAMs could make up for the low fly threat. You know, getting beneath it, and so
they need those long-range surface-to-air missiles in order to be able to lure the Russian aircraft into the lower altitudes.
That's right. Yeah, you want, that's important, is that sometimes you want them to go low because you want to pop up. And so you're actually dragging them into places you want them to go. So like some of these like urban shots, right? So in that particularly bloody day for the Russian Air Force, is that you saw these guys being dragged low. I believe in many respects is that the Ukrainians wanted in these certain engagements to get them low so that you could pop up with a mobile SAM and get them. You know, in a lot of these videos, you didn't see any counter movement from Russian pilots. They had no idea they were about to die.
I mean, that's because it's not a lot of reaction time. That's part. I mean, there's two issues, right? If you're a fighter aircraft and you're flying lower, one is that, you know, just distance is time. And there's not a lot of reaction time. That's one. Right. And the other part of it is those kind of aircraft are made to be maneuverable in higher altitudes where they can make much longer arcs, bigger arcs. The lower you go, they're not as maneuverable in the space either.
Air is thicker, yeah.
So, you know, it makes sense. So it's almost like a weird way you think, okay, so if they had these fighter aircraft, the Ukrainians, would they actually just be encouraging then the Russians to go high or higher, depending on where they fly them? And is that actually serving, you know, they have a successful air defense campaign.
A very successful. So the last question, well, we have two. I mean, we could talk about the no-fly zone. I mean, but the thing that I think is, I think what the Russians are going for, and I think that like in places where they have static built-up forces, they've probably achieved it. But again, we can't see this. This is anecdotal. We're not sure. Is that they have localized air superiority in certain places. And in those places, I think, for example, when you see these videos of like a TB2 where its optics are really stretched out, like I think I saw something like 48 kilometers, like very good optics. But it also tells me they don't want to enter the SAM weapon engagement zone of these surface air missiles. So I think in certain pockets, the Russians have achieved air superiority. What happens at the end here? Like I'm asking you to sort of step away from air power into how like air power impacts like politics or the settlement of a conflict, where you have sort of localized air kind of superiority in the West and localized kind of air superiority in the East and the South. Are we forever destined to have two opposing surface-to-air missile threats, on either side of the country that de facto splits it? Or, this is a purely hypothetical, but like, do you agree with that assessment that we may have like different pockets of localized air superiority by adversarial forces?
Yes, I agree with you that there, from what we can see, in social media and stuff, there is evidence to suggest that there is probably localized air superiority. I mean, that is one of the reasons, that's been suggested that when there was that really long convoy that was just sitting there, they got some hits on that, first of all, Ukraine. But one of the things that, we heard is that there was evidence that the Russians had more of their air defense systems protecting it and were making it harder, so that it was more dangerous. So I think, though, the one thing I would say, though, about the idea that like localized is to the west and, for the Ukrainians, and to the east, it's the Russians, is I think, again, that sort of is making it localized in time and like lateral distance. But I think it then misses the piece, which is that there's also an element of air control that's the vertical piece as well.
Right. That's so true.
And that third piece, I would just say, is like something that I think our joint force is really struggling with.
Definitely.
As there are these great quotes from some of, it's, general officers, during the recapture of Mosul. The person who was the general is in charge of U.S. special operations that were there, talked about how, quadcopters were such a problem at one point that it actually stopped operations. They brought it to a halt for a couple days. But he had this like quote where he's like, the enemy was able to get in underneath our air superiority. And I remember reading that and thinking, what does that even mean? Because do you have air superiority if someone is underneath it? And I think it's because we're seeing this decoupling of higher altitude airspace control from lower altitude. And that's something I think we have to like really wrestle with. I've often thought that, when you think about like the First World War and how, there was the Call of the Offensive, and you think, what were they thinking? My God, like they could look at the Civil War. They could have looked at the Russo-Japanese War. There was all this evidence that defense was going to be enormously destructive with firepower. I have this suspicion we're going to look back 20 years from now at this war and think it was so obvious what we were seeing about, the air war, but it'll only be kind of so clear in retrospect. But if I were going to place bets, I would say one of my bets will be about this issue of vertical control of airspace.
No, I think you're right. The vertical, particularly in the quadcopter range, not necessarily at the level of the TB2, but its distant and far cheaper cousin is something that I know the Air Force does not have an answer for. And they turf it off to the ground forces, sort of. And so it's going to be a continuing issue moving forward, which is let's call it the 25 to 5,000 feet vertical, maybe lower, 25 to 1,000 feet. I don't know. I see you shaking your head, but somewhere in there.
Yeah.
So with that, Kelly, I really enjoyed that. I could talk about air power all day, but so we'll have you back on the show. We'll do another episode because I'm the host and I can do basically whatever I want. So with that, thank you for coming on.
Thank you.
Thank you for talking through this. And maybe in about a month, we'll do another assessment. So thank you all for listening and have a good day.
Thank you.
Be sure to subscribe to Chain Reaction on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts to be notified about new episodes. To explore more from the Foreign Policy Research Institute's research, podcasts, and upcoming events, please visit us on www.fpri.org.